what our perception of time is and how our reality actually plays out isn't really actually a linear timeline. Is that right?
Yes, this is called the space-time continuum. So I'll make it very simple and then we can segue that into past life regression or future life progression. Now, according to quantum physics and astrophysics and all the fun academic disciplines, and this came out of the theory of relativity from Einstein back in 1905 and the general theory in 1915. So we live in the space-time continuum, which means that on the Earth plane, which is where we're on now, this is the physical dimension, and I'm going to elaborate on the other dimensions as we go along here. But on the Earth plane, past, present, and future are isolated in little boxes. Okay, I understand that and I have no problem with that. But when you go beyond the Earth plane into the fifth dimension, and we'll describe that because that's going to be a very important part to discuss, now all time is simultaneous. So let me give you my classic analogy to show you how you can relate to this on the Earth plane. Let's say that you were in a helicopter a couple of 100 feet above a freeway. Okay, and you're looking down on the freeway and you have a cell phone and there are three cars. One car is directly below you with a cell phone that you can connect to. One car is 5 miles behind it and one car is 5 miles ahead of it. Now, each car on the freeway cannot see each other. You can't see 5 miles behind on a freeway. But the helicopter, because it's above the fray, can perceive all three cars at the same time. There's your space-time continuum. So when somebody goes into the fifth dimension, which by the way is a good example of when you go to sleep at night and you go into your REM cycle, which is the fifth stage of a 5-stage sleep cycle that any neurologist can verify, okay? So when you're in this dream cycle or REM cycle, it's not just dreaming and going into an alpha brainwave. Yes, you're doing all that, but on a more metaphysical level, you're in the fifth dimension. So when you dream, you can now dream about a past life or a future life. In fact, very often the sneak previews of past lives and future lives are dreams. And you can also have precognitive dreams, dreams of the future. Now, there were some researchers back in New York originally in Maimonides' laboratory in Brooklyn, Krippner and Olner. They did a lot of research in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s about documenting precognitive dreams and how they actually came true. They would predict horse racing results or football or baseball or NBA results. So we have a documentation to this. All right. So it's not just a, wimp in a prayer and some high level of just wishful thinking. It's actually documentable, so to speak, or verifiable. So basically, that's what the space-time continuum is. So when I work with my patients, I'm training them to access into their higher self through hypnosis. Your higher self has access to what we call the Akashic records. The Akashic records technically is a fifth dimensional computer chip stored on the causal plane. And I'll go into the dimensions in a few moments, but let's just give you the big picture. So your higher self actually reads the Akashic records, and that's how you get information about a past, future, or even parallel life. So to define the terms, when you go back into a past life, that's called a past life regression. If you progress forward into a future lifetime, that's called a future life progression. And if you go into a parallel life, which is occurring now, but in a different physical body, your soul is split into different, shall we say, life forces, that's called a paragression. So these are terms, especially the paragression and progression, that I documented and named way back like 40 years ago. So that's what we're talking about. Now, when it comes to the idea of going into the idea of a past life and progressing into a future life, when people are on what we call the soul plane, which is a different dimension that I will document a little bit later on, you choose your next life. So the soul, which is really the life force, which is electromagnetic radiation, and again, we can document that. Scientific research has documented that. So the soul is actually observes its new life, and within 24 to 48 hours, it makes its sojourn into the body, and therefore is now staying in the body for the most part. although the soul leaves the body at night, every night into the REM cycle. So the dream levels are when the soul actually leaves the body, occupies a spiritual body, let's say the astral body, to go to the astral plane, and leaves a clone of itself like an alias on a computer, so that the physical body is not going to be possessed or attacked psychically by some lower astral entity. So that's what the system is. It's a matter of, this is a lot of science involved, but it's real. And that's good. So the nice thing about this is that the universe gives us this paradigm. In other words, this is not something somebody made up in a garage one weekend. This is something the universe has given us, not only to progress as a soul, but to eventually ascend from and to perfect our soul. So there's a real reason for this. And it comes from what we call the God energy complex, which is what your higher self, also known as the superconscious mind, originates from. So when I work with a typical patient, these are people who are typical profile. They have a fear of death, especially as they get older. They have habits and phobias, etc. So the advantage of these techniques is to eliminate the fear of death, to do what I call psychic empowerment, to take charge of your life, and to become immune to the previous habits or phobias or other self-defeating sequences that you might have been previously vulnerable to, and to access your higher self and your Akashic records and perceive your own past, parallel, and future lives. And that is the advantage of this therapy, which anyone can do, by the way. And for the benefits of your viewers and listeners, if they go to my homepage, there's a lot of information about private sessions. I do sessions by computer. 95% of my patients are done by either Skype, FaceTime, or Zoom. So they can actually do sessions with me without having to travel to Los Angeles. So that's one aspect. And of course, all my books and CDs are on my homepage, as well as I also do a monthly webinar, the second Sunday of the month, which I deal with different topics. And each of those webinars include a group hypnosis experience. So it's an experiential webinar. So just for the background of your viewers and listeners here. So basically, this is what we're dealing with here. The purpose of reincarnation, people say, why do we do this? Okay, why don't we just all ascend? Okay, that would be nice, and it's the goal, but it's to understand why we do what we do and to teach us to avoid repeating the same kind of mistakes that we have made throughout our lives and throughout history. Because remember, the average person on this planet today has at least 1,000 past lives. That is not impressive. You want to get out of here as fast as possible. But unfortunately, people make the same mistakes over and over again. So here's an example of one of my cases that I report in my original book, Past Lives, Future Lives, and its subsequent update, Past Lives, Future Lives Revealed. This is a woman who was a female photographer, came to me many years ago, and she was regressed to a past life in Chicago in the early 1900s, in which she was a really nasty mafiosa. Now, in this life, she suffered from anorexia nervosa. She was starving herself to death, okay? And she was not an unintelligent person, a very attractive woman, but again, she was really underweight in a very dangerous situation. The past life in the early 1900s in Chicago, she was a mafia guy, overweight, a creepy person, a murderer, a really nasty person. So she hated that image, and she had dreams of this person, and she finally identified as her past life. So she didn't want to be like that person. So that's why she was starving herself to death, to try to not be like this fat cat from the 1920s in Chicago. By doing the regression, and not just the regression, but actually doing the super conscious mind tap by connecting her to a higher self. That's the real therapy. She was able to overcome that negative background, and then she was able to gain more weight and become at a decent weight and to go on with her life. And that was a very dynamic case. Now, an even more exotic one occurred, what I call, what is known as hysterical blindness. This is a woman, she's a mid to late 20s. She was in her apartment and her boyfriend were there. And she goes into the bathroom to see what he's doing because he's been there for a while. And he was taking some amphetamine pills, which she did not know he was taking. These were illegal drugs, okay? So she said, what's going on? And he says, leave me alone, I'm taking my pills. I need this for energy, blah, blah, blah. So she freaked out, closed her eyes, and when she opened her eyes, she could not see. Now, this is not a medical syndrome. This is a psychosomatic syndrome. This is called hysterical blindness. She went to an ophthalmologist. The ophthalmologist said your optic nerve is in perfect shape, but she couldn't see because she was not supposed to see her boyfriend taking the pills. When I took her into a past life, she was in England in the late 1880s, and she was a little girl, and she, about 6 years old. Her father was a morphine addict. And one day when she was out to play, he said, get out and just go out and play, even though she was 6 years old. He was divorced, as you can imagine why. She came back a little early because it was cold out. It was like a late fall, early winter's day. She went to see where her father was. Her father was in the bedroom, and he was shooting up amphetamine into his veins. And he said, you shouldn't have seen me. You shouldn't have seen this. And he beat her up and threw her into the closet. And that's why she shouldn't have seen her father taking the amphetamine. And that was the origin of hysterical blindness. Within 15 minutes after we did the regression and the superconscious mind tap, she was able to get her sight back again. So those are examples. Now, of course, the most famous case of mine, which many of your viewers may be familiar with, is The Search for Grace. It was made into a CBS movie. It was a documented case of a woman who was obsessively attracted to a married man, that she couldn't break up with him, even though he tried to murder her on 3 different occasions. And back in 1927, by the way, she had in 46 lives that we did, regressions, she was with this guy 20 times, and he murdered her in every single life. The most recent was in Buffalo, New York in 1927, when her name was Grace Doze, and he was a mafioso bootlegger in the 1920s from Detroit. Well, as it turned out, she gave me a bunch of facts, about almost 24 facts that were verifiable by the CBS researcher, because they did the movie on this. And 2 of the facts that were not verifiable by the newspaper reports. At that time, there were 4 newspapers in Buffalo. Now there's only 2, or 1, I should say, the Buffalo Evening News. The newspaper said she was 30 years old at the time of her death, and that her name of her son was Chester Jr., Chester being the husband. Well, as it turns out, she was 32 years old, which is what her patient told me in trance, not 30. So the newspapers were wrong, and they all copied each other, which is what people do today. And that the name of her son may have been Chester Jr. by his birth certificate, but everybody called him Cliff, which is what she called him in trance. And I spoke to the grandchildren when this movie was aired back in 1994. Everybody called him Uncle Cliff or Grandpa Cliff. His Cliff was his name that everybody called. So she was right. Newspapers were wrong, and you can't get into New York City or state records unless you get the governor's permission. So nobody did a paper trail here until 1992, when the research was done and the movie aired in 1994. So that was one of the most documented cases of the last century. So that's an example of reincarnation, and we call this a retribution soulmate, where you reincarnate with the same guy over and over again, or woman, and there are no happy endings to the relationship. They're vicious, negative, nasty, abandonment, murder, you name it, embarrassments. And so that's an example of how you can actually rise above it. Now, when I did the regression and the superconscious mind tap, this woman, I called her Ivy in her current life, not her real name. That was done over, 35 years ago. And every year for the next 20 years, she would comment me and send me a message saying everything is fine, I'm doing fine, I'm in my life doing whatever. So that's a long-term history. So she definitely rose above her environment not by me, by accessing her higher self. Because remember, the higher self and the superconscious mind tap is 99% of the therapy. I'm 1%, which is 1/10 of an LA agent. So I don't take too much credit for this. The patients do it themselves by connecting to the higher self, which anyone can be trained to do. And by the way, during my workshop in Laughlin, Nevada on Friday, the 11th of June, between 3 and 4:45 p.m., I will be doing a complete workshop on regression and progression, which will include a group hypnotic regression and progression experience, as well as a superconscious mind tap. So if your viewers or listeners want to have that experience, want to see me in person, go to the workshop. And of course, everything is recorded there, but they want to experience the live regression, progression, and superconscious mind tap, they're welcome to do that. In addition, while I'm in Laughlin, Nevada, on Thursday the 10th through Saturday the 12th, I will be doing live patient experiences. I will be seeing private patients while I'm there for those 2 days or 2.5 days.